Welcome to the In Chamber, the place where we focus on the issues that shape business success. I'm your co-host, Rebecca Patrick. I'm the Senior Vice President of Communications for the Indiana Chamber of Commerce. Joining me at the microphone is Matt Ottinger, our Director of Digital and Legislative Communications. In Chamber is presented by Work and Learn Indiana. Today, we're going to discuss the very latest on COVID-19 vaccine mandates at both the state and federal levels and the implications for Hoosier businesses. Joining us today is Indiana Chamber President and CEO Kevin Brinegar. Welcome, Kevin.
Hello, Rebecca. Good to see you.
You've talked about the business community getting mandate pressure from literally every direction. On the federal side, the Biden administration wants to require employers with 100 or more employees to implement full vaccination or weekly testing. And that's 100 employees total for a company, adding all locations together. Please update us on sort of the status of this and what's happening with the Osha Rule right now.
Well, the Osha Rule was published in early November and was scheduled to take effect in full effect on January 4th, but there were also some additional requirements that kicked in on December 5th, including allowing employees, to have 4 hours off to go get vaccinated, as well as mask requirements for any employee that is not vaccinated in the workplace. That rule was challenged in multiple federal courts around the country almost immediately, and the Federal Appeals Court in Louisiana put an injunction out, and now challenging whether or not the president had the authority to put forth such a rule. And so this is now tied up in federal court, and we're waiting to see whether the regulation will stand and be approved by the courts, or whether it'll be struck down.
There's also news about the separate mandates for federal workers and contractors, as well as healthcare workers nationwide. They've both hit some snags. What's the latest?
Well, all of the federal regulatory mandates, whether it's federal workers, federal contractors, healthcare workers, facilities that receive Medicaid or Medicare funding, and the OSHA regulation and mandate on employers with more than 100 employees, all are in one way or another tied up now in federal courts, and implementation has been pushed back by the federal administration. And so there's this hodgepodge of federal lawsuits going on, and we're gonna have to wait and see how that all settles out. Most likely not until after the first of the year.
So let's move on to the new state effort, which really is in response to what's happening at the federal level. The state legislature is slated to introduce a bill when session reconvenes in January that could restrict businesses' ability to require the COVID vaccine for employees. That plan was unveiled when GOP leadership wanted to hold a special session on November 29th. They voted on this policy and the measure's other component to end the statewide health emergency, which was asked for by the governor. Ultimately, action was pushed off until the new year. Now, Kevin, you've been engaged at the Statehouse for 4 decades. How unprecedented was the move attempted by leadership? And how would you characterize the public hearing on the matter that took place November 23rd?
Well, the action and the process that the leadership was attempting to use was really unprecedented. It was a hearing not on a bill with an actual bill number assigned to it, but on what we call a preliminary draft that would later become a bill. I've never seen that in all my time around the General Assembly. I've only once before seen a special session held after Organization Day and before the regular session begins in January. That was in 1982, when the state was in deep financial trouble due to the 1981-82 recession and needed to raise revenues in order to have a positive balance in their general fund account at the end of the fiscal year. So this was totally uncharted water. They had a joint rules committee of the rules committees of both House and Senate, which is also unprecedented. And the hearing went on for 7.5 hours. There was really not a single person who testified in favor of the bill. And I think it could easily be described as a disaster. And particularly several senators were not comfortable with the process that was attempted to be employed, where they were going to have a one-day special session and sort of blast this legislation through the legislative process without further public hearings, without opportunities for legislators to offer amendments on the floor on second reading. And eventually the Senate, a number of the senators balked at that and shut down and said they wouldn't vote to suspend the rules to get this all done in one day. So the idea of the special session was abandoned.
Okay, and let's dive right into the draft legislation itself. And while it doesn't call for an outright prohibition on employers from requiring vaccines if they choose, it effectively does discourage that. Now, one way that's accomplished is through the provision that employers would have to foot the bill for testing unvaccinated individuals. How much of a burden could that potentially be for employers?
Well, we are grateful that this isn't an out-and-out prohibition as has been enacted in other states, but it's still very problematic and discouraging of employers having vaccination requirements. One of our board members who works at a manufacturing facility in North Central Indiana estimated that there were some 300 to 400 unvaccinated employees in their shop. And if they had to pay for them to get tested every single week, within 6 months, they would have racked up a cost of $1.2 million. So this is a big deal. Our position has been that since vaccinations have been readily available and free for months and months, any employee that's chosen not to get vaccinated should bear the cost of regular testing, whether it's per the federal regulation or this state law. And in fact, the bill draft is, in that respect, is contrary to the federal regulation, which says that it's the employee's responsibility to pay for testing or go to a free testing site, whereas this legislation says that the testing would occur at no cost to the employee, implying that the cost would then be borne by the employer.
Okay, interesting. And what are the chances that testing provision may be removed in the final bill?
Well, that's certainly what we're hoping for, because it is a very problematic for employers, because unlike the federal regulation, which says that employees that choose not to get vaccinated and have to go through weekly testing have to bear the cost of that testing themselves, the bill draft says that the testing would occur for employees at no cost to the employee. That means it falls on the employer, or unless the employer can direct them to one of the free testing sites that's in each county. But in talking to the State Department of Health, they say they do not have the capacity to provide free tests and administer them to all of the business employees who are working for companies that are requiring vaccinations. And these employees have gotten exemptions and opt out and go through weekly testing. The state just simply does not have the capacity to do that. So this is a real sticking point. It's our most important objection to the legislation, and we're going to be working to remove that provision or find some sort of compromise, because the cost implications for employers are just tremendous.
Another provision would expand religious exemptions and doesn't provide a legal remedy for employers. Explain this and how that differs from what's in place at the federal level.
Well, the federal level is guided by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and it provides some guidance as to what qualifies as a bona fide religious exemption. The bill draft of House Bill 1001 just says that to get a religious exemption, the employee has to provide a exemption statement, but it doesn't say who that should come from, and it leaves open that the employee themselves could write up a statement saying, I have a deeply held religious belief against getting vaccinations, and that would suffice. And if that were to be the case, then the employer really has no choice but to accept that exemption and put them into the testing protocol rather than requiring them to get vaccinated.
As noted earlier, leadership declined to move forward with the special session. How important do you think was the Chamber's voice and that of allies in encouraging that delay?
Well, your Indiana Chamber of Commerce was doing what it does best, and that's advocating on behalf of the business community. And through our testimony and that of other business organization allies and those in the medical field, we were able to raise enough objections and enough questions and enough problems with the bill draft, along with the fact that this was unprecedented and ill-conceived process, that the legislative leaders eventually, particularly driven by the Senate, said, we don't want to move forward in this fashion when there are so many unanswered questions, when there's so many identified problems with this bill draft. And so that's what helped shut this down. And it's given us more time to explore the legislation even further with members of our Employment Law Committee and our Board of Directors and others, and given us the opportunity to talk to the legislators, see what changes we can make, such as removing the pregnancy language that was in the original draft that was contrary to CDC guidelines, and gives us a chance to keep working on this bill. That's what the legislative process, the regular legislative process, is about. Is you have to go through multiple steps, and the public and the advocacy groups have a chance to have input along the way to either make bills better or convince legislators that the bill really shouldn't be pursued at all, as is the case sometimes.
Now a quick word about our sponsor. Work and Learn Indiana is where work-based learning connections are made. It's free, it's easy, it's a win for both Indiana learners and employers. Its newly updated website hosts Indiana's largest statewide marketplace of work and learn opportunities that promotes talent and career development. Details at workandlearnindiana.com. Despite the brief reprieve, this is a top priority for many GOP lawmakers. And Indiana is far from alone in this happening. Two questions. What is the motivation for legislators, and what's going on in other states?
Let me take the second question first. Several other states, again, with GOP-controlled general assemblies and in most cases governors, have chosen to react to the Biden regulation by passing legislation somewhat similar to what we have here, although in many cases they've gone farther by enacting an out-and-out prohibition against employers requiring vaccinations, which is in direct conflict with the federal regulation, and if that regulation passes muster in the courts, it would trump all these statutes that state legislatures have passed in recent times. Here locally, I think there are two motivating factors. One, you've got legislators who were going to be running for re-election, and the filing period starts January 5th and goes through February 5th, who want to be able to show their constituents that they've stood up to President Biden and are pushing back. And so that's one of the motivating factors. It's really political. The other is that there have been a number of anecdotal stories that have come to these legislators where someone has attempted to claim and file for a religious exemption from an employer's vaccination mandate, and the employer has denied that request, and so now they're facing termination. And members of the General Assembly, many of them feel that that's unfair and not proper, and so they feel like they need to do something to give a sort of a carte blanche religious exemption, which is the way the language in the bill is written.
Okay, and clearly the chamber is remaining highly engaged on this topic leading up to session. What would make for an acceptable bill for employers, and how do you see all this playing out?
Well, what would be most acceptable is if they stripped everything out except the first three sections, which have to do with the governor's emergency order, and would allow, in lieu of that emergency order, for the state to continue through declarations by the Secretary of Social Services and the Commissioner of the Department of Health to continue to receive the supplemental federal money that is coming into the state because we're under an emergency order. That would be the best outcome, and leave the rest of the bill out of it. But in particular, we've got to clarify that employers do not have to pay for the testing of employees who refuse to get vaccinated. And so all that language has to be cleared up. We would prefer that in terms of the medical exemption and the religious exemption, that they just reference Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, because the employers are familiar with that. They've been operating under that for decades, and it doesn't make sense for the state to have a separate, different definition of what qualifies for one of these exemptions.
As we wrap up things, a couple final questions for you. First, it's prediction time. Where do you see the state effort landing, and will the federal mandate be upheld or deemed an overreach?
Well, again, I'll take the second question first. There have been federal emergency temporary standards in the past, and many of those have been overturned by the federal courts. And the employment law attorneys I talk to think that that's entirely possible or even likely in this situation as well. But as always, when something's in court, time will tell. On the state effort, we're cautiously optimistic that we can reason with the legislators who are pushing this and find a ground where they can address the concerns of those constituents who are at risk of losing their job because they claimed a religious exemption but were not granted one, and also those workers for federal contractors who are facing losing their jobs as well, even though because there is no exemption available to them. And so we will continue to work on the behalf of our members and the employer community, and hopefully get this bill in a shape that we can at least be neutral on.
What parting thoughts do you have for employers that are concerned about what's occurring, especially with the mandates?
Well, I would encourage them to stay tuned with us, and we'll keep the information updated on what's going on in the federal courts, what's going on with this legislation, through IndianaChamber.com, through our legislative report that will come out every week when the session convenes, as well as our interim updates that take place in between now and then, that will keep us up to date on what's going on both at the federal level and here at the state level.
Thanks, Kevin, for joining us today. And I know the Chamber will continue communicating to its members and the business community on this topic. In Chamber is presented by Work and Learn Indiana. As a reminder, our COVID Stops Here campaign recognizes Indiana workplaces that have achieved widespread vaccination among its employees. Get more details and apply for the designation at indianachamber.com/stopcovid. As always, thank you for listening.